Hi, and welcome to the History at Home Winter Lecture Series from Schoharie Crossing State Historic Site. I'm David, and you're the audience. I am very, very excited about this program. Been looking forward to this for some time, ever since our last presentation from this gentleman from the D&H Canal Historical Society, and how exciting that was. Bill Merchant is the Deputy Director of Collections, Historian, and Curator for the D&H Canal Historical Society. He's also the Vice Chair of the D&H Transportation Heritage Council. He is still, and to the best of my knowledge, the only presenter that we've offered that also holds a U.S. patent. I'm not going to go on much more. I think Bill is going to present a fantastic program here. Thank you very much. And Bill, I'm handing it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, David. I would make one minor correction on your wonderful introduction. I'm currently now the president or chair of the Delaware and Hudson Transportation Heritage Council. I have other affiliations, but we don't need to hear about that. We're here to talk about something else. So first, I want to thank you all for joining me. And I want to say, if you have any questions, I actually have the chat button up too, and David will monitor them. And if I can manage it, I'll try and answer them as we go. But we'll also be able to discuss afterwards. But I'm really excited. I've never done this particular presentation, and it's on some research I've been doing over the last couple of years on the marginalized populations of the D&H Canal. But it's really great to do an in-depth look at each one of them, and I anticipate visiting the rest of the marginalized in future presentations on these various platforms, where wonderful sites like the Schoharie Crossing site give us this opportunity to meet one another and to enlarge our audiences. So it's really a great thing that they're doing here, and I really enjoy it. And the first thing I've got to say is that this research I just referenced was made possible by a grant from the Ulster County Community Grants Fund of the Community Foundations of the Hudson Valley. God bless them for finding this important enough and for giving me a little bit of money to direct my gaze this way. As I said at the time they did it, I would have been doing this anyways, but there's something different when people give you money and say, this is what you want to look at. And this is the direct result of it. And I anticipate an article on this topic should be, with any luck, in the Hudson River Valley Review next October. We'll see. I'm just about done with it. So with no further ado, you know, when I talk about the D&H Canal, I always start with the War of 1812, because for me, that's kind of the context and stuff. And so then, having set the stage, I get to hear. And what do I got here is a bunch of white men, some of them quite rich. John Roebling, one of the richest people in America because of his wire rope. But here we're going to do something different. This is the last. Was that a question, Fido? This is the last, pretty much. I might mention a white guy once or twice, but for the most part, we're going to talk about marginalized populations, about the people that they weren't recorded by historians. And so it's really, to some degree, happenstance. It's hard to find these stories. They are marginalized. People didn't think they were important. So what were my sources? Period newspaper accounts are great for a certain kind of story. And in fact, probably a lot of the stories we're going to hear today, I pulled out of newspaper accounts. And God bless Dorothy Hurlbut Sanderson, who used to work at the Ellenville Library, wrote that wonderful book you see there on the left, and also did so much research that there's a book out called The Raging Canal out of the Lake Wallenpaupack Historical Society. And it's just accounts of the D&H Canal in the press from 1872 until 1902. Really wonderful, obscure book, but you can get it from that particular historical society. Any serious D&H folk have to have that in your bookshelf. In the center, the testimony of the D&H Canal Company versus the Pennsylvania Coal Company. It's as you can see right there, it's some 8 volumes, some 5,000 words. I haven't even finished it yet. I'm about 3/4 of the way through my first read through. But I've gleaned some wonderful stories along with a lot of boring passages. There's a reason why people don't read court transcripts, huh? But this is a wonderful resource, and now you can actually access it at the Hathi Trust. And actually read it online if you really are interested. Otherwise, you have to have a set like I have, and I can't imagine there were that many copies of this particular book. And the final thing is period accounts from people that were there. John Willard Johnston being one. That's such a wonderful book. That's available from the Minisink Valley Historical Society. I love the 19th century prose, and this was written by a guy when he was retired after years as a surveyor and lawyer living in Pond Eddy, right on the Delaware River on the D&H Canal. And so he sees the the canal being built, the surveyors camp on his family's property. He and his buddies play surveyor on the strength of it. And then when he's retired and his wife has passed, he writes his reminiscence. And because he's a guy of a certain age, he really doesn't pull any punches. You know exactly how he feels about people. So he's a lot of fun and a great read for anybody that really wants to know about the D&H Canal. So especially being Black History Month, but in general, it's really proper that I point out that the D&H Canal crossed land that was originally inhabited by the Munsee and Lenni Lenape native peoples. Something that we all have to respect, the fact that this land was for millennia settled by an amazing culture that unfortunately is in tatters. I'm proud to say I'm 1/32nd Seneca, and as I always say, inordinately proud of that 1/32nd. And that's also kind of fits in kind of interestingly in this story, because I recently learned historian Eric Jarvis tells us that 85% of pre-Civil War people of color had Native American blood in them. And when you would speak to them, it was usually their great-grandmother. And he explained that when the Europeans come in the 17th century, that's when European settlement really kind of started, 1492 notwithstanding, they enslaved the native people. Even Columbus, who wasn't supposed to do it, did. But that's a whole nother ugly topic, isn't it? So what they would do, they enslaved the native people. Well, the Braves weren't having any of that. They were troublesome. And so a lot of them got shipped overseas to the Caribbean and Africa. They then brought in Africans. And meanwhile, what do you got? You've got a bunch of enslaved native women and largely male slaves now from Africa. And that resulted in, as I say, that astounding fact that 85% of pre-Civil War people of color had Native American blood. Because, of course, today we're just going to talk about the Black experience on the D&H Canal. And so when you do research on this, you're going to find terms that we don't use anymore so much. And the one that I run across the most in the 19th century is colored. Well, really, colored, you could be from India, you could be from the Caribbean islands. Of course, there's some Black blood in there as well. There's many people. Colored is an awful broad term. But of course, they also, the next most common was African, which makes it abundantly clear that you're talking about a Black person that was no doubt enslaved and brought over here to America. A sad fact of American life, it's still something that we grapple with, as you probably all know, to this very day. It's really, it's a shame and something that we really have to do something about. And that also brings me up to the white elephant in the room. I admit I'm a 63-year-old white man. I represent the problem to some degree. And as much as I want to be empathetic and as much as I try to wrap my brain around what other people's experiences are, I will respectfully try to lay out the facts as I see them. Historians speculate. We have to. If I ever speculate, I'm very clear when I'm speculating. I won't speculate much on this topic. There are a few stories that I'm going to feel compelled to have some comments, as I imagine many of us will, I would like to think. So what was the Delaware and Hudson Canal? It was a canal that connected the Delaware and Hudson rivers. More exactly, it was a 108-mile waterway, man-made, that brought anthracite coal from the coal fields of northeastern Pennsylvania along the Lackawaxen River, the Delaware River, eventually the Roundout Creek, to get to the Hudson River, where they were still 80 miles north of their main intended market, which was New York City. It was a phenomenal industrial enterprise, immensely successful, a stock that you wanted to have, first $1 million private enterprise in American history. They had to figure this out as they went along. Way before the railroads, canal companies like the D&H were figuring out what the modern American corporation will be like and how you can have a corporation that does this sort of thing. But they were a coal company, and yet they had a deep effect on the surrounding area as well. And this shows the route. This is from Manville Wakefield's excellent book, Coal Boats to Tidewater, and based on some wonderful maps that we now have access to from an 1854 survey the D&H company went. I'll be studying those maps the rest of my days. They're beautiful. The D&H Canal, this map is a particular favorite of mine. This is the Magna Carta of the D&H. This is a map made in 1824 to get investors. They sell out more than $1 million worth of stock in one day on Wall Street. And this map was something they sent out to get people involved. The D&H Canal was dug by low class, by the cheapest of cheap labor. And they dug a 108-mile long, 32-foot wide at the top, 20, not 20 at the bottom. I forgot to change this slide, 15 foot at the bottom and 4 foot deep. 20 foot has shown up in all the secondary sources, but my friend Paul King uncovered some research, the earliest minutes of the D&H, and it was 15 foot, and that makes more sense, actually. There was 110 locks originally, 22 aqueducts, over 200 bridges in 1825, and just half of the canal from my northern section up here, 2,500 men and 200 teams engaged in the work, making $12 to $14 a month. Even then, the European settlers didn't want those jobs. And in fact, John Willard Johnston tells us every contractor employed from necessity a large number of laborers, mostly in many cases wholly of Irish nationality. So a lot of Irishmen, and it was a huge migration in that period of young men from Ireland looking for work. But in all the primary source research I'm doing, and I'm working on a book on the D&H Canal, it's time to up the secondary sources. I find lacking in some aspects and wrong in some aspects. But I'm yet to find any evidence that people of color worked on the construction of the canal. I gotta speculate that it was the kind of work that they would be hired to do, most likely. And it's likely that they did actually do some of the work. We just don't know. But the great scholar and historian, Dr. A.J. Williams Myers, in his book, I think it was the Long Reckoning, talks about the canal fever and the economic boom in the early 19th century America, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. But as he says, the economic boom involved the rail and canal systems, but it was an economic boom from which the Irish would benefit, but there would be no benefits for African Americans. So Dr. Myers, who I greatly respect, would indicate maybe I'm not finding evidence because it's not there. Mind you, I'll keep looking because it would be important to parse this out. See if I can get my slide to. I had this problem last time too. Okay, you're going to give me the next slide, right? And I don't know why it won't do it. Well, let me keep talking to you while I try a little something here. My little handy dandy advancer, because I don't know this program well enough necessarily to get out of it and back in easily so I can get to my next slide. You'll all be happy to know that my new computer's in the mail. Although I don't know this is a tech issue. Give me 1 second, people. I'm gonna have to. Well,
Bill, it looks like you've hit the annotating button.
Oh yeah, there you go, right there. Did that get rid of it?
It looks like it.
Okay, there we go. Maybe I just used the other button. And here we've got documents. These are 2 acts. If we're going to talk about the history of Black Americans, we got to talk about slavery a little bit. And this might inform why and how they were employed. So it's pretty well documented that slave owners in the South rented out their chattel, the people they owned, to the canal builders in the South. But that did not happen in the North. Well, in Pennsylvania, they passed a gradual manumission law in 1780. So way before this canal, way before the War of 1812, or certainly by the War of 1812, depending, I don't know the exact specifics of that law, all of the people of color in Pennsylvania were free. In New York, it was a 1799, they passed a law. It's by 1828 that virtually all the slaves are free. And that'll inform another story I'll get to a little bit later in here. But it's possible that these people were employed here in the areas where outside metropolitan areas, slaveholders were 1 or 2 slaves on a farm, and it's possible that they were needed on the farm. There wasn't the excess number of slaves they had in the South to work in the canals. But in any event, again, I can't advance the slide. In any event, there was a. Oh, let's see, there's your problem. Okay, that's on. Yeah, sorry, folks, but the picture's so worth it that I may have to go out of here and let's see, get rid of there. And I was right there. Now start from the current slide. Let's see if that works. All right, until the next time. So we know they didn't, I can't say that they worked on it. I can speculate that, some of them must have, but it probably wasn't a huge presence. It's also very likely the Irish were known to fight amongst themselves so that their fellows from the town they were from would get to work. So it's fairly likely that there was a serious, if you wanted to hire the Irish, it might be you weren't going to hire colored people, people of color. But again, John Willard Johnston tells us that many of the men who built the canal went on to work it. And I love this. I'll have to read it. I don't usually do so many quotes, but I love this one. The mass were composed of the vulgar and debased, of ages from 10 to 60, of the various kinds, classes, and nationalities, Irish, Dutch, Africans, Americans, and others. All of the most lewd, vulgar, and depraved, and honesty compels the admission that the most objectionable features were found amongst the Americans. Some things never change. By the way, by Dutch, they probably meant German, think the Pennsylvania Bridge. To my knowledge, there were no Hollanders running around in wooden shoes working on the canal. And here's a little bit better look at that. So one of the things you'll find is that I don't have a lot of images, none of us do, that clearly show Black people on the canal. And so you find yourself in that uncomfortable thing of going, well, is that just a shadow, or is he, you don't really know. But I thought it was worth zooming in on these gentlemen, just, a bunch of workers. This is at Island Dock in the background, the D&H coal depot, and these are workers either waiting to unload or, it looks like they're probably just sitting in their boat waiting for their chance to unload. And here is the canal in Ellenville. I love this picture, just a great shot of the town. We've got somebody from Ellenville I know on. I noticed in the chat earlier. But here a little hard data. And as I said, we go to newspapers. Some 50 years later, there's a press account that the first boatload of coal down the Delaware and Hudson Canal was unloaded by 3 men, each named John, under a foreman also by that name. The loafers were of Irish, German, and African descent. The foreman was American. It just goes to show you how common the name John was, that all 4 of these individuals coincidentally were John. And from the start, once they started working, it's clear that the Black people were amongst the workers. And it makes sense because it was low paid work. And here's a picture of men unloading. And a wonderful, I'm on the board at the Century House Historical Society, which celebrates the story of Rosendale Cement, discovered when they were digging the D&H Canal. So, and largely transported for the first 70 years. More than half of North America's cement was this local Rosendale Cement. Some wonderful stuff. But in their archives, I found this document that you see on the left there that I don't know where it came from, but I'm inclined to have to believe that what they're talking about here. And what they say is that the coal shovelers worked in gangs of 3 men to a boat, and shoveled coal into the buckets, transferring cargoes from canal boats. Probably due to broken time awaiting assignments, they acquired the occupational name of loafers. In busy times, 50 to 60 gangs of loafers were employed. So that's 150 to 180 individuals, low-paid individuals, working in Rondout. And it explains why the town of Rondout, 3 farms in 1825 when the D&H Canal is begun, blossomed, turned into a huge town with a really, really diverse population. And now we get to that wonderful opening slide. This is Jim Jackson, the shoveler. This is from, if anybody follows us on social media, some 4,000 of you have now seen this particular posting. It's happens to be, it's from a glass negative in our collection, but this is the only photograph of a Black D&H Canal worker that I can tell you their name. Did we want Douglas's question, Dave? Well, it looked like a yes/no question. Let's see here. I'm going to keep moving on then here. So Jim Jackson, the shoveler. I'm told that he's got descendants in Rondout. And on my long list of things I want to do is to meet them and see if they can tell me more about this man. We don't have, as you'll see, we don't have a lot of names. We don't know. And as I say, this is the only picture. Can you imagine? So the D&H Canal Company had some 5,000 people working for it at its height. They had 1,000 boats with 3 men per boat. They had 108 locks eventually that until 1857 had 2 lock tenders. And so they had labor strife, a lot of strikes and the like. And this particular 1877 press account tells us, here, I'll cut a little bit, in talking about people not getting rehired after a strike. Among others refused work is the well-known and universally respected colored man who has worked on the dock almost since the canal was discovered. And of course, my that is Brother King. And that's interesting because the Brother King, we'll see that there's a much more often the nickname it wouldn't be brother, let's just say. That's also a wonderful photograph. Maybe I should go back for a minute to that. Recently discovered in our archives of Eddyville in Rondout. Wonderful. You can see over here. Do I get my pointer? Yeah. Steps to get up, presumably to a packet boat or to load people onto an unload laden boat. But very evocative photo. And here we've just got a postcard. It amazes me. Someday I'll do a whole presentation that's just going to be postcards because it tickles me to see the things that were made into postcards. Here's just a boatload of timber on the old D&H Canal in Wurtsboro, named for the Wirtz brothers, the progenitors of the D&H Canal. It's Black History Month, and we're going to hear a lot about this woman, Sojourner Truth, born enslaved, very near where I'm here in High Falls, New York. She was probably born and lived in captivity within 5 miles of where I'm speaking to you. Remember how I mentioned that slavery had been banned in New York State, and by 1828, there was this gradual manumission. So what would happen is that slave owners didn't want the value of their property to drop. They would sell them illegally to Southern slave owners. And in fact, Sojourner Truth had a son named Peter, who in fact was illegally sold down to somebody, I believe, in South Carolina. Sojourner Truth, with the help of, I believe it was Lucas Elmendorf, in the Ulster County Courthouse here in Kingston, New York, actually used the law to her benefit and had her son Peter freed. And as soon as she got him freed, she procured a place for Peter. This is from her book. As soon as possible, she procured a place for Peter as tender of locks at a place called Lockendale near Greenkills. This would be the Creek Lock section of Rosendale, basically where the D&H Canal opened out to the Rosendale, or excuse me, to the Rondout Creek for a couple miles before the guard lock. Let's see. I'm going to let Stephen annotate. When he worked with them, I'm going to approve that, Stephen. But that's asking me to annotate. All right, never mind. So, so I read this and my speculation, here's a lock. This is a great shot of lock 31, lined with white oak. Most of these locks were composite locks. A child operating a lock seems a little unlikely to me. I think it's more likely, children. So here's a lock tender after 1857. He's got the gear house. Now one man can control the locks from that building right there. So it's very possible prior to this period, so in the first 25 years, you needed a lock tender on each side to operate the big handles on these miter gates. Miter gate was invented by Leonardo da Vinci in the 15th century. A very cool idea. By being basically an arch, the pressure of the water holds it watertight or enough so that it operates. So I would speculate, we do know there are lock tenders as young as the age of 12, but 8 is still, and even if Peter if he was like his mother, a pretty big individual, it's more likely he wasn't the lock tender proper, but indeed he probably assisted the lock tender. But children were much more likely to be found here as what we call Hogies, mule drivers. And here's a young gentleman in his bowler with his team of mules, and orphans, families, children's in the later period, children hired out from the poorhouse. We're all would work on the canal. And also in my research on the marginalized, when I do a unit on children, there were more sightings of children being running off to join the canal. And there's a great story of a Black child being kidnapped and eventually freed. Didn't quite make it into this presentation, but there was more likely children would do that. And here is just so you're going to see all of I think it's 4 pictures I have that I think may show a person of color. Back in 2013, I had the Canal Society of New York touring here, and I had a discussion with one of the gentlemen who said that they had an intern and they were going through, I believe it was the Erie Canal's images, Derek, and looking specifically for pictures of people of color, and they couldn't find any. And we speculated that photography was expensive, they wouldn't waste the film on them, But it would appear that this gentleman, whether these, you know, you never know when you see a picture like this what the context is, whether this is people with their boat or what. I know that for the most part, they didn't ride the mules, they walked alongside them. Whether this man was a mule driver or a second hand, or whether this was just a photo opportunity, we'll never know. But it is a great photo nonetheless. I love this painting. It may be my favorite painting. I'll be doing a Facebook post about this next week, so you all get a little preview. This is an 1865 watercolor by the painter William Rickerby Miller, and he's painting locks 12 and 13 on the Rondout Creek. This is about 2 miles from where I'm sitting right now. But the reason this slide is in here is because locks 12, 13, and 14 were referred to in the latter period, and I'm not going to say the exact, I call them the N-word locks. That's right. My speculation is that being on the unpopulated side of town, the bustling village of High Falls, with multiple businesses, saloons, 8 mills, all of that activity was on the southern side of the Rondout Creek. These were on the northern side, the unsettled, and so it's possible that people of color were the only ones that would actually man these locks. And here's just another great shot. This is a feeder, but if you see right there, that's of the shanty on the low water end of probably lock. I believe this is lock 12, if memory serves. There's a dam, and they're diverting water. This is how they fill the canal. This is why canals are in river valleys. You could always find a level to go the longest without a lock. Locks being devices to get over changes in elevation. Typically, D&H locks would carry a boat 10 foot up or down. But somewhere, once the water once the canal was below the level of the water, you would capture the water. So just a nice picture. And here's a recent addition. That's Joppenberg, I believe, the mountain in Rosendale. I'm pretty sure, and I'm still working on this, but I'm pretty sure this is one of those so-called N-word locks right here. Wonderful stereoscope. Just a little interesting note. I have been seeing the remains of wooden bollards in some of my travels in my "Where is Our Historian" video on D&H TV, and it gives me great joy to see that's a wooden bollard right there, and so that lends some documentary proof to my speculation. We historians love it when we speculate correctly. And then I just thought, you want to see a really young Hogie? Here we go. By the way, Hogie, ho for stop and gee for go. They were called Hogies because those were the 2 words they said the most. Another wonderful stereoscope. Stereoscopes, there's another topic like postcards. They would do them with the most interesting things, although I have to say, for the most part, stereoscopes don't get as wacky and weird as postcards seem to get. Well, let's get a closer look at this. There's a lot of things to note here. One of them is that this is possibly, it could be lighting, but this may be a black, I would say he would be the second hand because he's at the snubbing post, minding the boat as it's just entered the lock, and it's going to be lowering. But here is the lock, the gear house. After 1857, all of the locks could be manned by a single tender, and that device had some of the mechanical things, and that lock tender could just operate all the gates from there. But more importantly to me, is this building right here, because that is the Depew Tavern, built in 1797. Here's a wonderful circa 1910 shot of it. This is now, the canal is now empty, so it's after 1902. This was the edge of the canal. This was 6 foot of water right here. But on March 12th of 1850, Jacob Depew, Simeon, the man who's built this building, his son, well liked by the canal company, he was sick with, and I quote, a serious rupture. He thought he was dying. And so he sells a bunch of real estate, $20,000 worth of real estate, to the D&H Canal Company, including this building. The crazy thing is that he lives another 17 years. Someday I'll have to get to the bottom of that story. And I got to talk to a medical historian to find out what a serious rupture might have been, much like the term colored, doesn't, piques my interest, but it doesn't give me enough information. But the other reason why I'm featuring this house is that we have now moved our wonderful museum and historical society into this building. I work there every day, albeit currently cold, but the electricity's coming. We'll have heat next week. we will be opening our new wonderful new museum and a Mid-Hudson Visitor Center. Oh, probably about a year from now. We're on track. We're very pleased. COVID has not slowed us down. In fact, it's been a wonderful opportunity. I'm kind of embarrassed to say, I don't know. You make the most of opportunities, and it gave us some wonderful opportunities. Some of which is to produce some wonderful online content that I hope you all, if you're interested in this topic, you'll go see the work we're doing. The PA Cole case, I'm as I read it, I'm able to get some pretty good histories. I got the stories of two great Irishmen just from their testimony. I'm yet to get any Black person's testimony, but they do mention them, and invariably, I think the only phrase ever employed is colored. The interest in this particular quote in the course of so you get a sense there on the left of why not everybody goes off to read PA Cole versus D&H Canal Company versus Pennsylvania Coal. But in the course of the testimony, they ask, there's questions, and they make the statement that the colored man was paid the same as the white hand who had replaced him, but who may have worked for less than others in consequence of his irregular habits. Again, I might speculate a bit of drinking. Was that another Irishman, I wonder? But the canal, it offered employment for people willing to work for low money. I can say definitively from my research that this canal could not have been built nor operated without Irish immigrants. And at that time, they were considered just above people of color. I don't want to dwell on this in Black History Month and when I'm talking about people of color, but they were the people that did the work, but it also gave them opportunities. And so in this little thing, they're halfway through the season, and they're going to talk about unprecedented number of trips. 92 boats, they're saying. Well, they're actually more at that point in time. But I'll blow this up. Some of the boats are now making their 7th trip, and the leading craft is the HB Holmes with Tony Gallagher, colored captain. Always has me scratching my head that they had to mention, but that's good because now I know that there was a captain that made his way up. So he was in charge of an entire boat and a crew of 2 other men. He had a certain amount of autonomy. He was his own hand, depending on how it worked. That's of course not him. That's a white gentleman with a shaded, just in the shade from his hat. But it's a great shot of a captain, and it's the cover of Larry Lowenthal's excellent book on the D&H Canal, the late Larry Lowenthal. From PA Cole, I gleaned this little fact, and this kind of points out again where it became an opportunity, as sad as it would be to modern sensibilities. Captain James Rose supplied an all-Black crew, himself, an 18 or 20-year-old, and a boy for $33 a month. Rochester Town Constable Peter Yapple had a bunch of boats. He was the town constable. He bought the boats. He was a businessman. He was an American entrepreneur. But he was quick to hire James Rose because the white captain wanted $7 more. Quick, do the math. That's a decent percentage, and that's a lot more money in the pocket of the owner of the boats. But an opportunity for Black men, and it was mainly men, certainly crewing. We hear some stories of women steering and the like. And I do know of one woman captaining a boat, and numerous women hiring them, but still an opportunity. Here's a wonderful E.L. Henry painting. E.L. Henry, a founder of the Cragsmore Art Colony above Ellenville, and he painted a lot of canal scenes that get mistakenly called the Erie in some instances, but he painted from the D&H Canal. I'm sure that he didn't mind people thinking it was the Erie because it just widened the market for his artwork. And I actually put up this slide, besides liking to have some colored images of the canal and loving E.L. Henry's work. But we do get, I told you I only had one photograph, but here is the only painting I know of a Black canaler. Fred Thomas, alias Black Fred. And this is all on the back of this painting. A hunchback canal boatman and guide to the trout streams was murdered by another Negro some years ago. And don't you know, he makes the New York Times. And this incident, why it gets in the New York Times in December, because he died sometime in October. But at any rate, this relates the fight and the fact that the one man was jailed, Mr. Depew, and unfortunately, Fred Depew, Fred Thomas died of his injuries. what a way to make the papers, but on your way out, you know. Here's a story that I was relating to a fellow historian a year ago and mixed up where my sources were. I thought it made the newspapers. It would have been an even worse story. In fact, this story came from my own institution's newsletter. And this is Earl Mack was a man whose father was a lock tender after the D&H Canal was no longer owned by the coal company. So this is the early 20th century, the 1900s. The D&H Canal ran from just east of High Falls to round out till at least 1916, possibly 1917. I'll work that out eventually. But it's a story about Jim Schoonmaker, a colored man who ran coal from Eddyville to Rosendale now. Well, now they're not transporting D&H coal from Pennsylvania. The canal has closed down most of its route. Now they're bringing coal in from the Hudson River because the cement industry is still using incredible amounts of the coal. Jim was loved and respected by all. Well, let's see if we really agree with that statement by the end of this story. He had a reputation as a superb cook. So one day, Earl and his dad are bicycling down the towpath. They see Jim's boat at the dock. They smell the corned beef and cabbage. They go in. Jim isn't there. They couldn't resist themselves. They eat the entire thing. Then they get on their bicycle. They see Jim and they run away. They don't even have the decency to thank him or to tell him his dinner's missing. According to them, when they met them the next time, they had a good laugh because after all, you know, he's a great cook. You know, I have a lot of problems with this story. You know, if this was a white man, would they have taken any of his food? They certainly wouldn't have taken all of it. Would they have even taken it without asking him? And by the way, would Jim have really, how did Jim really feel? Because I have a hard time thinking, yeah, he may have laughed on the outside, but, you know, because he knew even at that point in time, no good would come from it. But I just can't imagine he was very pleased. Can you? And here's a story I'm from another oral history. This is the source of this is a typewritten manuscript in the collections of the Wayne County Historical Society, and my friend Sally Talega has offered to get me a copy of it, but I didn't get it quickly enough. So I've got this from Dorothy Sanderson's book, and she talked about a superintendent of schools by the name of Frederick J Lewis, who worked on his family's D&H Canal boat. It was very common in the latter period of probably after the less to the canalers for coal than they had at other periods. Capitalism at work can be cruel. And so very often whole families were the only ones that could really work. You know, you didn't have to pay anybody. It was a subsistence existence. This man worked on his family's canal boat and they hired Sonny Jim as a Hogie. And he was known as Sonny Jim because he was, and I quote, of a very happy disposition and entertained the family and others with his singing and dancing. But other boatmen didn't like it, and a group of them who were members of the Knights of Labor became hostile. And they attacked the family. And the part of why I want to see the original source is it sounds like Sonny Jim wasn't even on the boat, but this family was suffering because they hired a black person. But while I was pulling this together, I was like, gee, the Knights of Labor, who are they? I go to Wikipedia, and that's where I got this is the Wikipedia. This is on Wikipedia. This is their logo. And it says that is the most perfect government in which an injury to one is the concern of all. And according to Wikipedia, they were fighting for everybody, including people of color. So this story belies, it questions just, you know, who the Knights of Labor really were. And anybody, you know, I will be doing more research on the Knights of Labor now just because of this story. So even if you were open-minded, it may not have even been that you were, you know, you may have hired Sonny Jim because once again, he worked for less money than somebody else you might be able to get to work for you. But this family, there was I believe a shooting, you know, shooting at the boat. Yeah, there was some serious acts of aggression. The D&H Canal was also cheap transportation, you know. So some people claim that there weren't any packet boats in the D&H. I can say definitively they were. Packet boats carried mail and passengers. But what happened, railroads early on could carry passengers easier than great freight. And that's why concerns like the D&H Canal endured, because they could still carry heavy things. Indeed, the Erie Canal today still carries really big stuff. So canals still have their place. Packet boats were kind of slow. So when railroads took off, packet boats kind of were on the Wanham Canal. So you don't see as many pictures of them. But the record, the primary source record, it makes it clear there were packet boats. We just don't have a lot of pictures of them because there weren't as many in the photographic era. But they did provide cheap transportation. And one of the sources that I'm reading said it was the primary source of immigration from the settled areas. So if you came into New York City, into Western Pennsylvania, because it went that way. So you could get on one of the boats going back to Honesdale. And this story here, Amanda Ayers and Black Hank Adams, presumably because there was a white Hank Adams, I don't know. The white girl and Negro who eloped from Beamerville, Sussex County in New Jersey, passed through Port Jervis, captured near Lackawaxen, so they're on their way to Pennsylvania, and captured on a canal boat on the Delaware and Hudson Canal. The girls claimed that she ran away because her parents were ill-treating her, and Adams said that she convinced him, but he did not want to go back to Beamerville because he thought he'd be killed. It's sad but true. Undoubtedly, he would have been lynched. Whether it was consensual or not, whether she asked for it or not. And again, this is an injustice that continues to this day. Sad to say. And winding down a little here, but I get one final story. Again, when you make the news, it's what labor strife. Well, it was nice to see that the captain that was the leading captain, but Katherine Shetmos, a colored cook on a canal boat, met with an accident, and so she makes the round out Deli Freeman because she was on the top cabin and her head got caught. You know, the old low bridge, everybody down. Nobody told her. But this is also tells us another, basically speaks about another injustice. And here's just another picture of people on a canal boat, a woman, whether she's a cook or not. Again, these aren't people of color, but you have so little to illustrate, and we have so many great pictures, and I do so love to show them off. Another very evocative picture of life on the canal. Boy, they put as much coal as they could in that boat. There's the gear house now. They're just leaving the lock. Here's an unladen, empty boat. Interestingly enough, actually, that boat should be over on this side to cross, but he must have tied off on the other side because that's the way they cross. The mule driver of this boat would just stop and they drop their line, and then this light boat could then just go right across and over it. But what do we have here? Captain Tony Gallagher, James Rose, Peter Hickson was a name that I gleaned from the PA Cole. Peter Van Wagenen, son of Sojourner Truth. Jim Schoonmaker, the very wronged cook. Jim the Shoveler Jackson, the only man whose picture we have. Katherine Shetmos. Joseph Hasbrook was another name I pulled out of PA Cole. Brother King from that press account. The ill-fated Black Fred Thomas and Sonny Jim. The cause of some strife from the allegedly egalitarian Knights of Labor. 11 names of Black individuals. I have 5,000 names in a database. And granted, my database doesn't say white, Black. And so some of those names may be. But I think that's a telling statistic of how marginalized this population is and why it's hard to uncover these stories, and why it's still important. But then I got a shout out for the women in the audience. I've only got the name of one Black woman, and that was because she may have even died. We don't know. I've not been able to follow up any further on what happened to Katherine and Shetmos. So I can say definitively that this canal could have been built nor run without the Irish and workers willing to work like people of color as well. And in fact, in some ways, it provided opportunities, ways to advance, certainly ways to be your own boss. If you're a captain, even if you're a captain for, say, the sheriff, you were your own man on the boat. You were the captain of the ship, and you spent your summer out on the water and traveling and making your own money, albeit for lower wages than somebody that wasn't dark complected. But with that, I would open up for any questions people may have, or I didn't get any in the middle. I probably didn't leave you the opportunity, did I, David?
No, that's right. There's a couple that came up in the chat, and I thank you very much. I just want to highlight the fact that your research into this is fantastic, and I know it's an ongoing process, an ongoing project to discover more of those stories of the untold, the Black experience on the canal. And thank you for doing that work. And hopefully, this also is an inspiration for others to kind of look into those stories, and maybe we can put some more names and faces together.
Well,
Make
to that end, I am part of. We were kind of really kind of helped initiate a group here in the Kingston area called the History Alliance of Kingston, and it's a group of some 14 different cultural organizations, all trying to do some online content and to share resources. We did a couple of scavenger hunts. I'd encourage you to go to the Hack, we call it Hack website, and you can participate in those hunts. But we're initiating on February 22nd, we're going to have a short Zoom, an hour-long Zoom meeting. We're initiating a research project. We want to have an online gathering place, kind of a study guide, and we're asking anybody doing research on the history of Black people in the Hudson Valley to please join and add your resources. The idea is that there is so little out there, and so I, in my way, have been doing research and will continue to, as it relates to the D&H Canal. The Hudson River Maritime Museum has got some great stuff about the cruise on steamboats and people of color working the Hudson River. The A.J. Williams Myers African Roots Center in the pond hockey, I'm going to say it wrong, the pond hockey section of Rondout is a member group. But the idea is that this is a hard history to parse. So what if we all tried to share everything we had? And what if we encourage people who might have stories from their families or pictures? What if we gave them a spot? Maybe we could get a better, a more complete picture of this history. Certainly, we don't lose anything by trying, and it needs to be tried. We don't. It would be, on one hand, I started out by saying I'm the white elephant in the room. Here I am, this 63-year-old white man, doing this history. But we all have to do it. I do it with pride, and it would be wrong to say, oh well, only people that are dark complected can do this research. No, everybody should do this research, particularly because it has been so neglected, because this population is marginalized.
That's a very good point, and hopefully a lot more will be illuminated in the Hudson Valley and across New York, and in plenty of other research that needs to be going on to share these stories and bring them to light. And I don't want to editorialize too much, but at the same point, you make some very valid points, and the fact that perhaps the additional hurdle in this kind of area would be that a lot of people may tend to think of Black history as being something that's much more of a Southern story, but it obviously does exist in this area, going through colonial slavery into early Republic slavery and the marginalization of those individuals throughout all of our recorded U.S. and New York history as well. So,
well, the largest population of slaves, I might get this quite wrong because I didn't prepare for this talk, but I believe that the largest population of slaves outside the slave states of the Confederacy later was in New York State. And I know, and the wonderful people at the Cragsmore Historical Society have done a video called Where Slavery Died Hard. The old Dutch burghers really were kind of attached to slavery. And Ulster County was not real good about slavery, even after they weren't good with their Black population, even after slavery is abolished in 1828. It's wrongheaded it's wrongheaded to think that, oh, that was a Southern problem. No, it was an American problem. Susan Dyson-Cohn is doing some wonderful research. She's got a book out that's just a collection of runaway slave ads. And the like. The D&H Canal started in 1825 and ran until 1898 as a coal company. It ran until 1916 or 17, largely moving cement for Samuel Kirkendall. It paid 30% on its stock, I believe it was 1862, during the Civil War. It was a stock you wanted to have, an immensely successful company. The Cornells and many of the robber barons, I'm blanking on the names because I don't have notes in front of me, were on its board. It was an amazingly successful company, first $1 million private enterprise in American history, and it continued as a coal railroad well into the 20th century. It becomes a freight line when heating oil overtakes it in the mid 20th century. And I believe it was in 1990 that it goes bankrupt and is bought out by Canadian Pacific. The name still lives on, and all the archives are now up in Toronto, making it very difficult for us scholars. But we were able to get copies of the wonderful 1854, 19th century company maps that are just a treasure trove of information.
So we did have a couple of questions. There was somebody asking if you have an actual year on the image of the shoveler.
That's probably about 1895. That particular guy, I've got photos from them. That was probably taken by Louis Hoysrat, who was the paymaster. I've got pictures of Louis, but I wasn't going to talk about Louis. I had a slide and I took it out. I said, no, you're not talking about the white guys. We have pictures of his starting in 1890. So it was sometime in that decade. I say circa 1895, but the one dated photograph I have of his was 1890. So it's in that late 1880s and 1890s.
And the presumption to be a lot of the images you shared in your collection are from that post-Civil War 1870s up to, you mentioned a few post-Canal in the early 20th century.
Well, I think most of our photographs in any of our, there are some earlier, and someday I've got one photograph that purports to be High Falls in 1863. That's just in my catalog. That's not enough information, but I'll take it on face value. It could be in 1863. We know that daguerreotypes are like 1840s, 1850s, so there's photography in that era, but it's really, you think Matthew Brady, it's really not until the Civil War that photography really takes off. And I'm inclined to believe, and there's another, boy, you do these talks and you get more things you have to go look up, right? I always say that really most of our photographs are the post-Civil War era, from what I can tell,
Right. And the point you also made is that it's that much more difficult to find images that show Black or colored people because obviously there's that prejudice and the content and the imagery that they want to put out there and they need to market or sell, or those that are willing to pay the money to have their own portraits done. Something that's going to wind up on a postcard is going to be predominantly geared toward Caucasian, toward whites, toward that kind of, for lack of a better term, that pale face.
Yeah, well, the white elephant again. So in the course of my research, there's a very famous picture of the little Freddy, the little Freddy with the Cameron family, and they're waiting to cross one of the rolling aqueducts, probably the Delaware. There's some controversy on that. There are people here I see who might chime in. But when I discovered that one, I then had a gentleman, Steve DeGroot in California, send me a family picture of his great-grandfather taken at either the same spot or a similar spot, either the Lackawaxen or the Delaware, where they're only a quarter or a half mile apart. I've since found 4 photographs taken of canalers waiting to cross the aqueduct. And so it's clear to me that some enterprising photographer, perhaps Hensel, who worked out of Hawley, would do it. But it looks like some photographer would just set up, take your picture, and say, when you come back in 10 days, I'll have a print for you. But so who do you think is going to invest in that?
Right.
Probably your lower paid workers weren't buying pictures of themselves,
Right. Canal boat captain might be willing to do that, or an owner. But it's you make this kind of parallel when it comes to photography. These photographers seem to be quite enterprising. Everything from the photographer at the amusement park, or the guys that used to fly overhead in the helicopters, the airplanes, and then take pictures of your house and show up at your doorstep trying to sell them to you. Or there's even some articles that I came across almost immediately after the Civil War, where photographers were coming up with ways to film or to photograph people at the gravesite of their loved ones, all for $1, I suppose.
Yeah, a corollary to that famous picture of the Duff images. There's these pictures of the final picture of somebody after they passed, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
And so if we could go back, just revisit Doug's question, if you have a little bit more kind of a thought on if local people being often hired to build, much like the Erie Canal, the D&H Canal, some locals being hired, and if the mass hiring was kept down for African Americans or Blacks because of prejudice, or also hiring of the Irish and their prejudice toward Blacks as well. If that was predominantly sort of where it doesn't reflect either in the documentation for the construction, or potentially just they weren't being hired.
Yeah, again, I speculate that because I know that the Irish, Johnston, a guy who was there at the time, talks about how the Irishmen would just on a Sunday afternoon, they'd cross one another. They're from two different towns. They just take to a fight before a word is uttered. So they're already fighting one another to make sure that their townfolk, if you will, got to work. Imagine how they felt. So you needed a workforce. You needed them to work cheap. You had a lot of young Irishmen. Um, Not to cast aspersions, but they probably frowned on that, and so the contractors just wouldn't hire black people because they needed numbers, and there were plenty of Irish. But this is speculation, and I've seen too much speculation and secondary sources unfootnoted and said as gospel. That it makes me very leery. I won't. There's a great story. I'll lay this out because maybe somebody can help me with it. A mule was $100 in 1850, a good mule. So a team is $200, a substantial sum, a couple years' wages for most people, right? And the story goes, because so many of the Hogies were orphans, that if a team went in, you were told to rescue the mule team first, because you could always get another orphan. This is an oft-told tale. I do not have a primary source. To me, this is lore. I questioned it the first time I heard it. It seems a little, it's not inconceivable, but anybody out there? I'm historian at canalmuseum.org. If you can find me a primary, God love you, because I'm looking for it. It's a story that's out there that everybody knows, but that, like so many things everybody knows, can you prove it?
That's a good point. I was going to make a reference to the fact, at least on the Erie, as horse holes in order to pull your horse or mule out. I've never heard anything about an orphan hole, so. But there's another question that comes in from Peter about if you know if there's any factual basis to the Canal Boat to Freedom novel, the canal being part of the Underground Railroad.
Yeah, and I was just having this discussion with some historian or other. I don't think so, I forgot. I don't have a copy here. When I was in the office this morning, I meant to go pull it out to see if they footnoted, to see if there was. But my feeling, there's so many Underground Railroad stories. Well, the first thing about the Underground Railroad, you didn't put a sign, right? It was underground for a reason. You were doing something illegal. But there's so many people that say, they've got a little cubby hole, they've got this. And the family story is that beware of family stories, people. The family story is that that this was on the Underground Railroad. I think you really have to look at transportation routes. Pennsylvania freed its slaves way before the canal era. So there weren't there were slaves going into Philadelphia. They were more likely to find their way to New York City and up the Hudson. So maybe the Erie, they're trying to get to Canada. So the Erie probably was, and I'm sure I have not looked into this, but Derek can probably weigh in on this, that the Erie probably could talk about, it probably was a one of the routes for the Underground Railroad. But I scratch my head and think, yeah, they were going from a really unsettled territory that only became settled because of the extractive industry. So there weren't the slaves there to get out of there. So I think that it's a wonderful story. It's a great way to introduce children to the injustice of slavery. But I have a feeling that it doesn't have any sort of historical basis. But I did mean to, and I will. If you want a follow up, you can email me a reminder, and I'll take a look at the book and see if they have a source. I read it so many years ago, I didn't think to look. That's one of the reasons why I love Dorothy Sanderson, because of all the secondary sources. She's a rigorous footnoter, so you always know where her stories came from. And as much as I love Wake, there's a couple wrong stories in Wakefield's book, and he did not footnote hardly at all. And so it makes it harder for us now to come and really to uncover the truth.
Right. And you make a good observation. If this particular D&H, from my understanding of it, was predominantly for that commerce and that coal movement, when it might have been a lot easier to gain a more secure, secret passage going up the Hudson with steam travel, and then yes, there's some accounts, and probably not nearly as many as could be otherwise parsed or dug into, of runaway slaves or enslaved people making their way on the Erie, particularly out toward Buffalo or the Oswego Canal, and making it across the lake. It's you make it out to Lewiston and Buffalo area, and it's a very short hop over the river and into freedom in Canada. So I suspect there's quite a few of those folks that would make it into New York, and make their way up toward Albany, perhaps be provided some assistance from the Myers family in Albany, and then make their way west and eventually into Canada. If Derek has any thoughts on that, Derek from the Erie Canal Museum, who's tuned in, if he's still on, wants to give any sort of thoughts, I'd be more than willing to take that in.
Yeah, sure. Why not? I'll take a quick stab at it. Again, these are largely hidden stories, but I know we do have some evidence. At our museum, we have a painting like Madonna of the Canal, which it's based off tale of. We have primary source evidence and everything of a family of freedom seekers moving on the Erie Canal who unfortunately attempted to commit suicide when they thought they were going to be caught by slave catchers in Syracuse at the locks there. So they were certainly using, well, luckily, the adults survived that attempt. Sadly, the child didn't. But yeah, that's, I know, one specific example we have of people using Erie as a route for the Underground Railroad. And that one we know about because it made the news. So I would assume you did.
Yeah, that's a super tragic one. If that's the one I'm recalling, which the boat crew thought it would be amusing to make comments toward their passengers that there was a bountyman on their way to get them.
Yes, yeah, it's a really tragic story, but yeah, it does show us evidence that the canals were used as a route for enslaved people trying to find freedom.
Right. And I'm not too sure about the D&H, but go further a little bit with the Erie, that it's also it's a conduit for the ideology or the concepts and the abolitionist movement, and not just for the movement of people, but for the ideas to help support that. But I think with the growing commerce of New York, it generated different class structures, and as the waning days and then the end of slavery in New York, and then after slavery in America, that you have still this sort of neo-slavery that occurs, and the separation of people that kind of downplay a lot of those stories, and as Bill's pointed out, the marginalization of many people who've made serious impact in the state and in the country. And while I'm thinking, I did mention the Myers residence in Albany, and so I see on our list that Mary Liz has been joined in, so I will give a total shout out that if anybody's in the Albany area and is able to stop in, that's a wonderful historic site, a wonderful location to stop in. It really kind of helps tell that story, and so I'm going to give them a plug while I have that opportunity. There's a few other questions coming through. Carl was asking if the D&H Canal was a successful financial venture, and if you could, again, kind of go over the beginning and the end dates for that.
Yeah, so begun in 1825, completely opened in October of 1828, operated as a coal canalway until 1898, when Samuel Kirkendall buys the entire thing for $10,000. Cost a couple million to build and a couple more million to expand. It goes for 10,000. It's hard to say what happened to the southern end of it, but he operates it from Wurtsboro for a couple years. But eventually he sells part of it to New York O&W. But then it does operate from just east of here, High Falls, New York, to the roundout till at least 1916. So that's the full date of the canal, both as a coal canal and then later. I can see the chat here now too. I really love Alyssa. Thank you for that. I've written down the name of. She points out How the Irish Became White by Noel Ignatieff. Boy, white man talking. Talks about the conflicts. I'll be buying that and reading that. Buying it probably when I get off this call even. So thank you for that, Alyssa, for sharing that with us. And then William wanted to know about the term Hogie. I see it written, we always spell it Hoggee. Hogie's the way we pronounce it. I've read sources that say that it was only used on the D&H and the Erie. Maybe Derek or David can speak to that. But then I also read that James Garfield was a Hogie on the Ohio Canal. You know, it's another one where you don't have a primary source, but it's been around. That's that's the phrase. That's what we call them. When I first used the phrase on social media, somebody weighed in and said, "Oh, ho and gee, that's left and right for oxen," and I had to think about that for a minute. But I know from testimony and PA call, amongst other things, one canaler says some of the mules were smarter than the boys. The mules knew which way to go. They were on a 10-foot wide towing path. You didn't need to tell them left or right. But many D&H boats operated shorthanded. You're supposed to have 3 people: somebody steering the boat, a bowman there to be at the front to push off from trouble and to handle the ropes, and a mule driver. But very often they'd save money. They'd run with just 2 people, which meant that the mules were the Hogie, the mule driver, was going to be going between the boat and the towing path. You needed your mules to know when to stop and go. A lot of trouble could happen if your mule didn't ho when you said ho. So I stand behind the Hogie being, and not coincidentally, when I took horseback riding in college back in the 70s, those were the terms I was taught for stop and go. Gee or click noise, gee up, but the hard G sound. But yes, some source also said that it was a regional term, just these New York canals.
And I do know of a few dog sledders that will use that for left and right. But obviously, training your dogs a little bit different than training horses or mules.
But again, the source is just a comment on a Facebook post, but was saying that when you were running your team of oxen for plowing, that those were the terms for left and right for the oxen. So.
And Alton makes that question about the work for pay arrangements in the business period, if they've been contracted on paper. So perhaps it's kind of highlighting the fact that there might have been a lot more folks working on the canal that otherwise you wouldn't know by name or have any other data on, based on the fact they're just day labor or maybe they're not sort of like paying anybody on the table now. If you got somebody working on your boat that you don't have, is there something on the D&H Canal where you have a manifest of your crew and anybody else among passengers?
We've got lists of boats, and I think it contains the owners. Dr. Powell, if he's still on the call, could probably speak to that. Looks like we lost him, actually. And what we do have is contracts to boat captains. So if you're the captain of a boat, you might sign a contract with the canal company. It was usually the contract was because they were selling you the boat and they were taking out $10 to $20 every trip. To pay for that, that boat could be anywhere from $800 to the earliest boats were about $400 by the mid period, by the 1850s, between $400 and $1,400, and then the latter period as much as $1,800 for a boat. And so there were contracts for that, but virtually the rest of the crew there was no paperwork. They didn't care. Early on, the D&H Canal hired everybody and supplied everything. Within 2 years, they abandoned that. I'm assuming theft. You just couldn't keep track of all that stuff. And they start selling the boat to you, and now you're an independent contractor. But as we know from Peter Yapple, here's a man that's got the means. He buys 2 or 3 boats, he puts crews on them, and he operates them as a money-making venture. He pays his crews, pays for the boat, and eventually he makes the money. The interesting thing about the D&H Canal was that, so you're running, it's a one-way traffic as far as the primary product, the coal is. You're running it down to New York City into the Hudson River. So you got a 130-ton burden boat after 1850, 30 tons in the earliest period, going back, possibly empty. Well, the canal company reserved the right to put 3 tons of material on your boat. Why not? They're running the darn thing. You're buying the boat from them. They move their stuff for free, but that still left you an awful lot of room on your boat. And as I read through Pennsylvania Coal, what I discover is that the boat captains willing to work harder and willing to look for, up canal traffic, if you will, for traffic on the return trip, would end the season with a couple $100 in their pocket, where a lot of the captains who didn't work that hard got their back pay. Because the canal company was smart. They didn't give you all your money. End of the season, you got, I forget what percentage it was. And I tongue in cheek would say, so the Irish had money to drink on for the winter. But in fact, it was a paternalistic a thing on their part. But as far as pay on, we've got the paperwork we've got, and it would mainly be contracts for the boats. And we've got, I'm not counted, but I've probably got 5 or 6 in my archives, but there was 1,000 boats at the top period. So a lot of paper that's probably just gone by the wayside.
Right. Yeah, we get a lot of questions about boat manifests, or who worked on what boats, who was at what lock, and some of that information's out there, but it's a lot more difficult than just looking at some database or some master list that's kept somewhere in an archive somewhere. You really have it's much deeper dive. So Bill, I really want to thank you for your time this evening in this wonderful presentation. I'm going to give a quick shout out to Derek as well for jumping in.
Just one other thing, David. I just decided to check. We have through, I believe, Dr. Powell got us these down at the Carbondale Historical Society. It's an 1832 account of the arrival and departure of boats in Honesdale, and it's a multi-page document. I've had it on my computer. I've got somebody working for me. Maybe I'll have them transcribe these. It's 167 pages, and it has the names of the boat owners and some of the workers. So there's a source. Note to self: I've just got a young history major from Hunter who's looking for work to do in New York City, and that'd be a really wonderful one. So
that sounds like a great intern/grant project. That's fantastic.
Well, we're trying to be careful. Paid internships. This gentleman came to us. We don't have the money to pay. We've done internships through the college, but we want to make sure. My first meeting with him was yesterday, and the first thing I wanted to do is this has got to be you've got to get something out of this as well. So I'm trying not to just throw him those chores that I'm like, oh, grown, but instead give him chores that he might find fascinating. And so I'll bring it up with him, but I'm trying to give him the experience he needs for his resume and get something of value for us. But we're loath these days. It's bad form to consider interns a way to not pay people to work.
That's true. That's the way it kind of sounds. So yeah, I had a really fantastic time with this presentation. I really appreciate your time this evening, all the research that you're doing. I put up some links in the chat. Hopefully people will be driven to canalmuseum.org.
Correct. And we've got some 66 video as short as a couple minutes, and some of these presentations, I think when this one gets up there, this will be the 6th full-length presentation. But we've got a tour of my old museum, which is now gone. That virtual museum now will be video of the work in progress at the museum. And I think the very first episode of that will probably go off in the next week or two. And then we've got Where is Our Historian? My favorite episodes, because I go out in the field in the spring, winter, and fall, depending on the weather and the snow, and I guide you through what's in the ground today. I've identified we're right now in the midst of rewriting the National Historic Landmark listing for the D&H Canal, and I'm fortunate enough to be the lead historian for the effort. I've identified 181 sites that I think have to be protected. Extant remains from the D&H Canal in the ground today. That we'll keep a list of in my museum, but I hope most of them will also find a place in this listing in the National Historic Register. The D&H Canal was an immensely important American story. It transformed our country by supplying cheap fuel. And it wasn't just a regional thing, because America, in 1812, it was just the states east of the Appalachians. So the D&H Canal does not get the love it deserves. And the Canal Society and the Delaware and Hudson Transportation Heritage Council, my colleagues at many of these organizations, shout out to Robert Powell at the Carbondale Historical Society. We're out there to let America know that this is your story. Just like Black history is American history, the D&H Canal is an important American story that everybody should know.
I'd like that. Yes. And somewhere in the chat, I posted up the YouTube, but yeah, people go to canalmuseum.org. They can reach out to you. They can find a link to the YouTube. And I'm super grateful for the opportunity to play host to such a great presentation, and to have you be a part of our winter lecture series, and also for part of the Black History Month, to kind of, I guess, help share some of these undertold stories. So with that, again, thank you all for those that have joined in, those that have been a part of this with us. And shameless self-promotion, that if you found this interesting enough and would like to provide a donation, this is a free Thank you so very, very much. I appreciate it. Take care. Have a wonderful night. And Bill, I'll be talking to you again real soon.
Great. We'll talk. We'll get a link to this, and we'll get this up for people that weren't able to see it today. I know. Before I leave you, Dave, Max Freeburn writes for the Schoengum Journal here, and he called me today wondering if there was a way to see this today or early tomorrow. I guess maybe he's writing an article about it.
I'll do my best to get this turned around as soon as possible.
I hate to do that to you, David, because you're such a gracious host, and we have to meet in person this summer. I've got to come
Absolutely.
to Schoharie Crossing. I'm very optimistic we'll be able to meet in person before this year is out.
Yes, I'll give you the dime tour. Won't charge you a cent for it.
God love you. Well, then I'll leave a donation. So there you go.
Very good. Thank you all very, very much. Have a wonderful evening. Stay safe.